There's a joke in German. You can't say you to me. You won't understand this joke and you won't find it funny unless you've learned German. It's about the translation of this English you. You have already learned that there are two translations. Du if you're talking to one person, ihr if you're talking to several persons. Okay? Unfortunately, that's not the whole truth. There is something more to it, because du and ihr can only be used in informal situations, meaning you're talking to family members, you're talking to friends, you're talking to children, you're talking to people you know well. In formal situations, in business, or when you talk to someone, to a government official, to a police officer, yeah, usually also any stranger actually, we use another form. You might know this concept if you've learned, for example, French or Russian, where we also have a polite form, you might say, or a distant form. And fortunately in German, this is not another verb form, so there is nothing new to learn actually. We use the third person plural. So the form sie, like sie sehen, okay? If I translate it back to English, it means they sing. Very weird. Why would you say they? Languages are not always logical, especially the German language. So this is just something to accept. So look at the following example. Beate, willst du essen? Informal. Herr Meier, wollen Sie essen? Formal. Okay, so this Herr Meier is just one person. I still use the plural form. That's just the way it is. Also note that when we write it, we use a capital S for the Z. Of course, when you speak, nobody hears it, but when you write in an email or yeah, any text, the S is capital when we don't mean they, but when we mean this formal you. Okay, now you might notice another thing. In this example, I used Beate with a first name to use the du form, and I used Herr Meier, meaning the last name combined with Mr., which in German is Herr, and the equivalent for Mrs. is Frau. I think that's pretty logical. When you're using first names, the informal form is appropriate, whereas when you use last names, then you use the formal form. Which means also that when somebody from Germany introduces themselves to you with a first name, it means they expect that you are going to use the informal du form. And when they use a last name, they expect the Sie form, the formal form. Now, the problem is, of course, you might not know whether a name is a last name or first name. And to be honest, the whole situation is a bit trickier, is a bit more complicated, and I'm going to go into the detail. But if you say, oh my god, it's too complicated, too overwhelming, you don't have to watch the whole video. Actually, just stick to my advice, which is, if in doubt, stick to Sie. Okay, if you're in a situation where you're like, should I use du here? Should I use sie? If you're in doubt, use sie, because you can't do anything wrong. It will not be perceived as rude. If people expect you to actually use the du form, they're going to say it. And this is something, by the way, you cannot just go from sie to du whenever you become a bit closer, when you become friends. This is not happening. Somebody has to mention it. So, for example, somebody will say, sollen wir nicht du sagen, or something like that. Forget about this phrase for now. It will come later. But we actually do have verbs for this. We have the verb duzen, du duzt, which means to say du to someone, to use the informal form, and sitzen, which means to use the formal form. If you want to dive a little bit deeper, there is a change with this in the German language. When my father was a university student in the 1950s, 1960s, he told me it was common among the students to use the formal Sie form. For modern German students, contemporary German students, this sounds absolutely ridiculous. Like students among themselves, of course, nowadays they use the informal du form. But with a professor, you would still say Sie, and the professor will also say Sie to you, okay? So is Germany becoming less formal? Is the du form disappearing? Not quite. It's not like in the Scandinavian countries where we had it and it vanished more or less completely. I was talking to a manager from East Germany a couple of years ago, and he told me that before 1990, it was relatively common in East Germany to use du at the workplace to somehow signal that, well, we are all one big socialist family. And of course, that was hypocritical, and everybody knew it. So when after 1990, often West German management took over these companies, and the West German managers would use the Sie form with the employees, that was considered as respectful. So somehow there was a revival of the Sie form there. On the other hand, in West Germany, even back then, the Du was considered to be a bit more modern and youthful and dynamic, and the Sie was a bit more old-fashioned, conservative, elegant. And this is still a bit the situation today. So for example, when you're in marketing and you want to address your customers, you have to choose. Do you want to say du? And your brand will be perceived as like modern, cool, dynamic maybe. Or do you want to say Sie, and it's a bit more like elegant, old-fashioned, and so on. So basically, if you're selling machinery for, I don't know, power plants, you will definitely use Sie. And if you sell skateboards, you'll definitely use du. But sometimes it can be really tricky to choose. So that's a challenge that marketers in Germany have. A bit more to it in special situations, I call it du in farming and fitness. So there are situations where we're actually meeting strangers and we still use du. One of the situations is in rural areas where it's much more common in villages, but people say du to each other, although they barely know each other, or they know maybe they should know this other person, but they saw them twice in their lives and went to school with their cousin or something like that, and they will still use du, which you wouldn't do in the city, but in the village it's like somehow, well, we're all from the same village, so it's much more common in the village to use du, even in situations where we would otherwise use Sie. And the same in fitness, meaning if you're in a sports club, if you're in a choir, if you're in any hobby group, it's also much more common to use du, even though you might not know the other people there at all. And also the general trend that young people use du much more often than older people. In these clubs or unions, this rule doesn't apply. Everybody says du. How do you actually go from du to Sie or from Sie to du? Because you can't just go like this, it will not happen just casually. Well, one thing at the beginning, once you have arrived at du, you don't go back. Okay, so once you say du to someone, it's rude to go back because you're suddenly putting a distance into the relationship. Some people do that when it was awkward. So Friday evening you went out with your boss and you had a little bit of too much beer, and the boss said, hey, let's say du, and then Monday morning he remembers, well, it's actually a bit awkward, so he changes back to Sie. If you're the employee, well, I guess you'll have to accept it. If you're the boss, please don't do it. If you said that on Friday, stick to it. It's weird to change back. Some people do it in a conflict. So they have been saying du to a colleague for many years, and now suddenly there is a fight, and they change back to Sie. So childish. Please don't do it. But some people do it. The only situation where you should consider it, or you should actually do it, is say you have a colleague and the colleague has a 5-year-old daughter, and you say du to the daughter. Now you meet the daughter again 20 years later, and you still say du, and the daughter says Sie. This is something we always want to avoid. We don't want two people in one conversation using two different forms, okay? So if you're the older person in this case, please offer the du. Please tell her, hey, shouldn't we say du to each other? Which brings me to the next step. How do we go from Sie to du? We can't just change just like that randomly. I told you that before. You have to offer it somehow. So we even have in German, we have this expression, das Du anbieten. It means to offer the du, to offer somebody to use du form. Who does that? In business, it's usually the boss. traditionally, in traditional etiquette, there were very elaborate rules on who should offer it to whom. So the older person offers it to the younger person, the woman offers it to the man. Of course, these rules can be a little bit contradictory. So say you're a 30-year-old male manager of a small team at a company. For some reason, you all say do to each other, and now you have a colleague joining. She's 60 and female. What are you supposed to do? Wait until she offers the do, or should you make the first step? Well, I would say in this situation, it's a bit awkward if everybody says do, and she's the only one that you will use sie with. So I would go and be a little bit diplomatic and say something like, for example, hier im Team sagen wir alle du. Ist es für Sie in Ordnung, wenn wir auch du sagen? Like, offer the do, but be a little bit polite, be a little bit diplomatic. As I said, these rules are a bit contradictory, and of course, yeah, at some point we just have to decide and to do something. Of course, nowadays, offering do is not a big thing anymore. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that really meant something. It meant that you were very intimate, that you knew somebody really well. So it was like a question of expressing trust. Today, this is all out of the window. It's a bit more that you want to be less formal, and that's it. But traditionally, you could see, for example, people would want you to know that they use do in relation to somebody else. So, for example, for some reason they said do to the mayor of the city because they knew her, and then they would want you to hear them using the do form in the conversation so that you would notice, they're close to the mayor, they know her. So, of course, nowadays all of this is ridiculous, but still you cannot just change from sie to do. If somebody offers it to you, of course you accept it. It's rude to refuse it, although traditionally that was also somewhat acceptable. But no, if somebody says, shouldn't we say do, you go for it, you accept it. The only exception in my view is if it violates company rules. If, like, in your company is unacceptable, and it would be really awkward. And again, let's think of the party, like your 19-year-old intern is a bit drunk and says, hey, shouldn't we say do? And then you're like, oh my God, but on Monday we're in the meeting and everybody will know that there's something weird and we're not allowed to do that because the company rule, So then you can say something like, for example, danke, aber ich glaube, es ist besser, wenn wir beim Sie bleiben. But do this very polite, okay? And try to avoid it. Usually it's rude to refuse it. For you as an English speaker, I guess it's not a big problem, but some Germans that are old-fashioned might want to refuse it, and again, it's considered rude. Other weird things that Germans do and you shouldn't do. There is a form that is called Hamburger Sie, because it's relatively common in Hamburg, where people use first names and Sie. So, for example, Beate, wollen Sie essen? And I'm like, just don't do it. If you want to use first names, go for du. If you don't want to use first names, then stick to the Sie. It's that simple. But you can hear that sometimes in television. For some reason, it has become quite widespread. I find it very weird, me personally, because I'm like, why do you need like still one different layer of formality? It's not necessary. The opposite is called Münchner Du, where they use last name plus du form, okay? Maya, kannst du mir helfen? Don't do it, it's weird, okay? And of course, what is also very weird is when you mix them. So like addressing the same person, you're not consistent. Look at this job advertisement that I found. It's from a startup from Berlin. They want to be cool, so they use du, although they're in business. But then at the very last paragraph, they tell you who you are supposed to send the application to, and this is some Herr. So obviously they expect you to use the Sie form when you're applying for the job. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so if you write the job ad, be consistent. If you want to be cool, then accept that people are going to use the do form. If you don't want to be cool, use the C form everywhere, okay? Don't mix it up. Are you up for some cases to try, something a bit more tricky? Of course, the thing is, as you might imagine by now watching this video, this is tricky even for Germans. And we might have different opinions on what to do and what not to do. And sometimes there are situations that are a bit weird. I went to a bank, for example, a couple of years ago, and I said "du" to the employee because he was my age. He was, I knew him, well, I didn't know him personally, but I'm in a village and I knew who he was, and I thought it would be like this "du" in farming. But then he replied to me in Z. Awkward. So what did I do? I switched back to Z because I realized that obviously he wanted me to use the Z form, or he had a company rule that he had to stick to. So I didn't want to embarrass him, so I switched back to Z. So even for Germans, sometimes this is a bit complicated. Okay, let's look at a few cases. You might stop the video, reflect upon the case once you've heard it, and then I will tell you what is my suggested solution. First thing, you're at Z terms with your boss, and then you meet the boss at the chess club. And in the chess club, everybody says "du." Okay, what do you do? My suggestion is stick to the Z, because the company hierarchy trumps somehow the "du" familiarly, if the familiar "du" in the chess club. It's my personal opinion. I would wait a little bit until the boss considers it a bit weird and takes the first step and says, "Hey, shouldn't we say "du"?" So if you're the boss, then it's the other way around. And please notice the situation and maybe say "du." But that brings you to another problem, because then you go back to the company and now you're saying "du" to this one colleague, but not to all the others. Yeah, a bit tricky. What you can do is something that I'll explain in the next case. You're in a basketball team. You say "du" to everybody, although you might not know the people very well, or you might barely know them. And one day you're at your job, and there is a supplier supposed to give a presentation about product, and turns out that the guy who is presenting is one of your basketball teammates. So you didn't know that that he was actually working for the supplier. I would actually stick to the "du." I would find it rude to suddenly use the Z form if you have been using the "du" during training all the time. But I would tell my colleagues. Okay, I would say, "Oh, what a surprise! We know each other from basketball," and then you can go to the Z form. What do you do if you offered the "du" to somebody, but this person refused? So politely, she said, "No, thank you." Just don't make a big deal out of it. It's a bit weird, as I said, but just accept it. Just say something like "Natürlich, kein Problem, selbstverständlich," and just move on. Stick to the Z. Okay. So I hope you have enjoyed this video a little bit. It's been quite deep about this issue. You can see it is an issue in the German language, unfortunately, but again, don't get scared by it. It's not a big deal if you get it wrong, especially if people understand that German is not your first language. They will not say, "Oh my God, this is so rude. Oh my God, this is so weird." No, it's just very normal that even we as Germans are confused with this situation, and we make mistakes occasionally, or we don't find a perfect solution occasionally. So again, my advice, if in doubt, stick to the Z, but otherwise feel free, of course, to use the "du" wherever it's common, wherever everybody uses the "du."